Wow. So I just want to introduce our speaker tonight. His name is Salvatore Amana, and that's a very Italian. I speak Italian, so I might have butchered your name. So Sal, as I call him, he is a journalist and writer who lives here in Calaveras. You may have seen some of his articles in the Valley Springs News. He's the contributing historical editor there, and he has a collection of wonderful 500-word stories about the West Calaveras, and these have appeared there since 2006. They're collected under the name Something for Nothing, and the books are wonderful, and they're for sale at the table should you want to buy one. Sal, I will say, and he doesn't want a big introduction, but I'll just say that I consider Sal to probably be one of the top 3 living historians that we have here in our county. And that's all me saying that, but I truly believe it. Sal is also the founder and president of the Society for the Preservation of West Calaveras History. And that's a nonprofit organization. Yeah, I will turn it over to Sal now. With a warm welcome.
Thank you. No battle was fought between the blue and the gray in California. No blood was spilled in this state. Yet we might not be one country indivisible today without California's role in the Civil War. Without the gold from the Golden State, the Union might have run out of money. More than $5 million in gold each month traveled east from California to back the bonds the Union used to finance the war. California also provided more volunteer soldiers per capita to the Union Army than any other state, nearly 17,000 men out of a population of 430,000. The state's quota was only 6,000. Those volunteers, including Daniel Severance of Calaveras, who served in Company H of the 8th California Infantry, helped the Union by replacing the 3,500 regular Army soldiers at Western outposts protecting settlers against hostile Indians, allowing them to head back east and join their comrades. Their presence thwarted Confederate designs on the west and kept the gold, and just as importantly, the copper, used to cast Bronze cannon and make telegraph wire in Union hands. They guarded the overland mail route, the immigrant trails, and the transcontinental telegraph lines. They also kept an eye out on what the Mormons were up to in Utah. On the day the war ended in 1865, 4 years after it began, those soldiers ruled over more territory, more than 1 million square miles in the West, than the Union Army occupied in the East. Over the years, I've created a roster of every man who lived in Calaveras and served in the Civil War, whether before or after the war, and it's available at westcalaverashistory.org. That roster currently lists 882 Union soldiers and sailors. Another roster has 82 Confederates. Of those who fought for the Union, at least 132 are buried in Calaveras County, including Patrick Henry Egan, a private in Company C of the 7th California Infantry, and he's buried in Angels Camp, and George Russell, the rather tall man on the right, who served in Company F of the 7th. When he was buried in 1929 in Sheep Ranch, he was the last Civil War soldier buried in the county. The most important event in the lives of these men was not the gold rush, but rather the Civil War. And yet their stories have been long forgotten. Those men who served and died during the war, as well as those who served and lived, helped shape California and Calaveras. At least 7 men were in Calaveras during the gold rush and then became generals during the Civil War. James Steedman was at Poverty Bar, where he became the first engineer to successfully dam the Macomb River. He later became the military governor of Georgia. Thomas Van Buren created Double Springs before going home to lead a New York regiment. George Evans became the Adjutant General of the state of California. Alexander Hayes, known as Fighting Ellick, was wounded in the left arm and right eye at the 7 Days battles in Richmond, Virginia, then wounded in the leg at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and then killed in action by a gunshot to the head at Wilderness, Virginia. He was made a major general posthumously. Lucius Fairchild, as you notice, lost his left arm at Gettysburg and later became the governor of Wisconsin. All had been 49ers in Calaveras. The only true military action in the far west between the Union and the Confederacy took place in New Mexico. But it involved what was called the California Column, which included 10 companies of the 1st California Infantry and 5 companies of the 1st California Cavalry. Nearly 4 dozen Calaveras men were part of that group, including Anthony Anderson, who was born in Norway. It is the California Column which in 1862 stopped any chance of a Confederate army invading California via Texas. But more Californians wanted to fight. So when a group in San Francisco discovered that Massachusetts was having a hard time meeting its quota, they offered to raise a company of 100 men from California who would serve together in a regiment of cavalry from Massachusetts. The governor of Massachusetts agreed, but only if the Californians provided their own uniforms and equipment and paid for their own transportation to his state. In December 1862, after pooling their bounties and taking advantage of a half-price fare from a steamship company, the California 100 departed from San Francisco Bay. Designated as Company A of the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry, they trained outside Boston before being assigned to duty in Virginia. They were rough, individualistic men and chafed against military discipline. Desertion was common. Of the 2 Calaveras men I have identified as being among the California 100, Colburn Nellis deserted while in Massachusetts. But the soldiers who stayed, including Benjamin Locke of Calaveras, were very good soldiers indeed. During one expedition, they charged across the river to attack a detachment of the 44th North Carolina. They captured 123 Confederates, officers and all. Back in San Francisco, more men wanted to sign up for action. With Massachusetts still having trouble filling its quota, 4 more companies of Californians set out for the east, eventually becoming known as the California Battalion, Companies E, F, L, and M of the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry. From Calaveras, I found 16 soldiers among them, including Alonzo Still. In May 1863, they were assigned to duty around Washington, D.C., and before long were in battle in the Shenandoah Valley. Brought together, the California 100 and California Battalion were arrayed against the Confederate forces called Mosby's Rangers, renowned for their guerrilla tactics. That suited the Californians, who were skilled as horsemen and gunmen. They had never read a textbook on military tactics, but they were notoriously good fighters. Unfortunately, their officers did read those textbooks and occasionally led them into disaster. The Californians suffered heavy casualties. Some were killed, and many more were wounded. Worse yet, many were captured and sent to horrific prison camps. 3 Calaveras men were captured: Jake Cassell, Ephraim Pinney, and John Spaulding. After his capture at Drainesville, Virginia on February 22, 1864, Spaulding was sent to the notorious Andersonville prison. On June 19th, he died of a common condition in prisoner of war camps. Something I am loath to mention, but I think important to do so to impress upon people how these men suffered. He died of chronic diarrhea. John Spaulding, age 29, was buried at Andersonville. And this is his gravestone on the right at the Andersonville National Historic Site. In July 1864, the rebel army crossed the Potomac and advanced on Washington. At one point, a few Californians from Company M and Massachusetts men from Company D were the only troops between them and the White House. Other details of the regiment slowed the advance, and when reinforcements arrived, Washington was saved. Later that summer, the 2nd Massachusetts fought bravely for 21 straight days. During a charge at Halltown, Virginia, their captain was shot dead from under his horse. The gallant Lieutenant Charles Meader from Calaveras took over command. The next day, he was killed when his brain was pierced by a minie ball. One member of the California 100 wrote, quote, "There were men detailed to bury the dead, and it took them 2 days to bury what they had killed in one. There is but one California officer left in the regiment out of 14. Battle-tested and battle-scarred, the Californians participated in one of the hardest marches of the war in 1865. For 1 month, the battalion marched and fought, destroying all that could be of use to the enemy for almost 300 miles. Many other battles followed, until a white flag came forward from General Robert E. Lee's headquarters. The California Battalion was present at Lee's surrender to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The California Battalion even marched in the victorious Grand Review in Washington. Of the nearly 500 Californians who had begun the fight, only 182 were left to muster out. And left they were. Any who wanted to return to California had to pay their own way home. After discovering these stories of bravery and sacrifice, when someone says to me, "Oh, but nobody from California actually died back east in the Civil War," I set them straight. From now on, I hope you do too, including about the Calaveras men who died. Meanwhile, regiments raised in California stayed in the West. 4 companies were raised mainly in Calaveras. By comparison, both Amador and San Joaquin counties had 3 each. Calaveras contributed Company H of the 3rd California Infantry from the Comanche-Campo Seco area, Company I of the 3rd and Company H of the 8th from the McColney Hill area, and Company E of the 7th, mostly from Campo Seco. In addition, about a quarter of Company G of the 2nd California Infantry was recruited at Angels Camp. Wrote the Stockton Daily Independent, "In almost every town in Calaveras, a company of infantry is being formed." Meet Hiram Ashley Messenger. Born in Massachusetts, Messenger came to California in 1852 and for several years worked for the water company around McColney Hill. He then did the first successful copper mining in the Campo Seco area. In 1864, he sold all his mining interests for $5,000 to raise a company of soldiers for the Union at his own expense. This is the muster roll of his Company E of the 7th Regiment of Infantry, California Volunteers, called the Gold Diggers Regiment. Nearly all of the 80 or so men were from Calaveras. And this is a rare photo of Captain Messenger in his uniform, taken in early 1865 as they trained at the Presidio in San Francisco. As young as 16 and as old as 45, they were miners and blacksmiths, farmers and teamsters, born everywhere from New York to Germany, Norway to Canada, Chile to Illinois. They sailed to Southern California and then marched 651 miles east in 34 days. before arriving at the dusty adobe town of Tubac in the Arizona Territory. While on their march, Lee surrendered. President Lincoln was assassinated, and the war was effectively over. But conflict they would still see, and their experience was typical for these California regiments. One hot summer day, Messenger and about 30 men went scouting for Apaches who had killed a man named Parker, his wife, 3 children, and a Mexican. About 65 miles east of Tubac, they camped at San Rafael, where Messenger ordered Sergeant William Kelly, and Private John Henry, 2 Irishmen, to locate a missing citizen and a Private Jacob Hicks. After they left, the civilian and Hicks returned on their own, saying that they had heard gunfire a couple miles away. Messenger took half his men to investigate. When they reached the scene, they were surrounded and attacked by 150 to 200 Indians. During the hour-and-a-half fight, 15 Indians were killed, and only one of Messenger's men badly wounded. Thanks to a sudden thunderstorm, the Indians were unable to effectively use their arrows. The Apaches had only 2 rifles, but they were the Springfields of Sergeant Kelly and Private Henry. The next morning, Messenger searched for and found their bodies, stripped and terribly mutilated. A newspaper reported that, quote, Henry had his head pounded in with a rock and 27 wounds on his body, evidently with a blunt lance, after they had killed him. Kelly also had his head bruised, but less wounds. In Company E, typical of the times, whether in the East or the West, more soldiers died of disease than from battle. Henry and Kelly would be the only men in Company E to die in action. 9 other soldiers would die from illness, from pneumonia to malaria. More than 400 soldiers in California regiments perished throughout the West. They too gave all. After the war, a flood of veterans from across the country came to California looking for a better life, not unlike what happened following World War II. Job Francis Thomas, for example, was a Civil War veteran who served in the most elite unit of the Union forces and was seriously wounded in the bloodiest one-day battle in American history. Born in New Hampshire, the 22-year-old shoemaker joined Company G of the 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters. These are reenactors of the U.S. Sharpshooters during Civil War days in Clements a few years ago. To become a member of Berdan's Sharpshooters, a volunteer was required to fire 10 consecutive shots at a target 200 yards away, with each landing within 5 inches of a bullseye. Only half of those applying passed the test, and they formed the first sniper regiments in Army history. The green uniform in the middle is what Job would have worn. One of his first significant actions took place in Maryland at Antietam, the war's first major battle on northern soil, where 87,000 Union troops faced 45,000 Confederates. By sunset, 22,717 men were dead, wounded, or missing. More casualties than in any other day in U.S. military history, including D-Day. Private Thomas was shot in the right hip, a wound severe enough that more than a year passed before he was released from a hospital. Job returned to New Hampshire, married, fathered 2 daughters, and accepted a $12 monthly pension. In the late 1880s, he and his wife relocated to Burson, where he became the postmaster. He also became a charter member of the county's first post of the Grand Army of the Republic, the organization of Union Civil War veterans, when Chickamauga Post 149 was established in, of all places, Burson. For that GAR post, the highly respected Thomas held various titles, including the highest of post commander. Another soldier took an even more perilous route to Calaveras. John Wesley Dawson was born a slave in Virginia in 1826. After President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, regiments of freed slaves were formed, and Dawson enlisted as a private in Company C of the 22nd U.S. Colored Troops. This is a spectacular photo of John Dawson, taken in 1886 by the great Stockton photographer John Pitcher Spooner. Dawson and the 22nd served near Yorktown, Virginia, before participating in the sieges of Petersburg and Richmond. At Petersburg, white Union forces exploded a mine under Confederate fortifications, but the subsequent assault failed. When Federal troops advanced to the rear in haste, i.e. fled in retreat, Dawson's regiment was thrown in the gap to stop them. Their success prevented the Confederates from overwhelming other Union soldiers. It appears likely that, in recognition of his actions, this was when Dawson was promoted to sergeant, the highest non-commissioned rank. The 22nd occupied Richmond, where they set up refugee camps to house former slaves. Perhaps it was when Lincoln visited the conquered city that Dawson reportedly received a citation signed by the president for his bravery at Petersburg. When Lincoln was assassinated, the 22nd was one of the Army units that participated in the memorials. Soon after, they were sent along the Potomac in pursuit of the murderer John Wilkes Booth. Eventually reassigned to Texas, the 22nd served along the Rio Grande until mustered out. From Texas, Dawson traveled to California, where he farmed in San Joaquin County, married former slave Lucy in Sonora, and sometime after 1880 moved to a 160-acre farm near Jenny Lind. Dawson, too, was a member of the Chickamauga Post in Burson. Today, his name can be seen among those of more than 200,000 others inscribed on the Wall of Honor at the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Again, it just amazes me that he was here. In 2010, at Dawson's gravesite in Jenny Lind, the Society for the Preservation of West Calaveras History acknowledged all of the Calaveras men who died during the Civil War with the playing of taps and by reciting their names and tolling a bell for each of them. Reenactors fired a salute. And most importantly, the descendants of Sergeant John Wesley Dawson, including his great-great-great-grandson, paid tribute to his life. Two soldiers who later lived in Calaveras served both sides. Alabama-born Linza King deserted from Company G of the 34th Arkansas Infantry, Confederate States of America, and joined Company E of the 3rd Arkansas Cavalry, United States of America. Elijah Swinford was a private in Company C, 1st Regiment, Missouri State Guards, Confederate States of America, before joining Company M, 12th Missouri Cavalry, United States of America. Then there's the story of Jenny Lind resident Elisha Randolph Lawrence. When Confederate soldiers went to his home in Winston County, Alabama, to forcibly conscript him, the 24-year-old tobacco farmer and father of 5 could not be found. Lawrence, who strongly disapproved of slaveholding and breaking up the Union, was hiding in the woods. An officer instructed his men, "Boys, take up 2 or 3 boards from the floor." Elisha's children later recalled, "This they did. Then they went out and fetched some straw. This they placed under the boards and started a fire. The children all huddled around their mother and began to cry. And she said to the men, 'Please don't burn our home for the sake of my little children.' Finally, the soldiers relented and put out the fire. Lawrence made his way through Confederate lines and joined the Union forces, enlisting in the 1st Alabama Cavalry. That's right, there was Alabama units in the Union. His family, meanwhile, faced continued persecution, with soldiers taking their food and trampling salt into the earth so the ground could not be farmed. His wife Sarah suffered from hunger, but always made sure the children were fed first. Elisha's service may have included a leave of absence for illness as well as capture and imprisonment until he was mustered out and returned home, where his wife died later that year. Remarried he fathered 5 more children with widow Mary Ann Walls, whose husband had died on the Confederate side. Eventually, he settled his family in the Jenny Lind area, where he died in 1916 at age 79. Yet, let us not forget that the Confederacy has strong support in many places throughout the state and in Calaveras. I've often wondered how Yankee and rebel veterans and sympathizers dealt with each other once the war was over. Meet Dr. William McKendry Gwynn. He was not only one of the most powerful and well-known political figures in early California, but also one of the most controversial. By 1867, when he purchased the Paloma mine in Calaveras and renamed it the Gwynn Mine, one of the first and richest gold quartz mines in California, he had already been one of the state's first 2 U.S. senators and twice been arrested on suspicion of treason for supporting the Confederacy. To some in Calaveras, thanks to that gold mine, Gwynn had, quote, done as much for the prosperity of this county as any man in it. To others, Gwynn was, quote, a hoary-headed old traitor. Gwynn's own sense of loyalty was more basic. This is my country, he told the New York Times. I was born here and intend to leave my bones in its soil. Gwynn died in New York City in 1885 and is buried at the Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland in a rather unusual mausoleum. His son, William McKendry Gwynn Jr., became a state senator representing Calaveras and Tuolumne. Captain Messenger was on the Union side, and Senator Gwynn on the Confederate side lived side by side in Calaveras for many years. Messenger even moved to the town of Gwynn Mine, today's Paloma, when the gold mine reopened. He ran a boarding house there and became the town's postmaster. That's right, the town named after a staunch Confederate. Following his death in 1910, Messenger was buried at the Campo Seco Protestant Cemetery. Wrote a newspaper, in accordance with the expressed wish of the deceased, Captain Messenger was laid to rest clothed in his full military uniform. So that uniform you saw earlier in that photo from San Francisco in 1864. There's another significant connection with the Gwynn Mine. This is the gravesite at McComney Hill for Edward Hanford, who was a teenage private in Company H of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry on October 9th, 1864, when at the Battle of Tom's Brook, Virginia, he personally captured the battle flag of the 32nd Virginia Cavalry, and for his extraordinary heroism was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. I believe he's the only Medal of Honor winner from the Civil War buried in our entire region. He died in 1890 in an accident at, of course, the Gwynn Mine. What's the only town in Calaveras named for a Civil War veteran? Daniel Smith Burson wanted to join an Illinois regiment, and he and his neighbors in Bureau County headed down to Springfield to enlist. But the state had filled its quota, and they were turned away. About to return home, John Brown Jr., son of the famed abolitionist, came along in charge of a company he had raised in Ohio and that had faced the same obstacle. Brown was headed to Kansas and told the Bureau County boys that they too might go there and enlist under that state's colors. Shipping their horses on the Hannibal and St. Joe Railroad while they themselves rode on the top of the boxcars, the Illinoisans traveled to Leavenworth and were mustered in as Company D of the newly formed 7th Kansas Cavalry. In the 1870s, Burson would move to Calaveras, and this is his gravesite in Lockford. I would like to conclude with the words of soldier and Burson postmaster, Job Francis Thomas. This is a portion of the poem he wrote and read at the Memorial Day commemoration of 1891, and I am honored to recite it once again. All honor for those who fought for freedom's cause so long ago, who in the thickest of the fight stood firm and bravely met the foe. who, when the call to arms rang forth, came from every loyal town, grasped their guns, stepped to the front, the rebel flag to trample down. Our comrades' blood cries from the soil of every southern battle plain, and the saddened memories of their toil today returns to us again. God above and men below, the faithful watch are keeping, and while the seasons come and go, may we guard our comrades sleeping. When at last life's trials pass, we'll meet our comrades once more, whose feet have trod the path to God. They are not lost, but gone before. Thank you. And if anybody has any questions, be happy to take them. I mean, I think one of the interesting things when I came here was that how so little had been done about the Civil War here. That it was like forgotten or no one mentioned it. There was no articles about it, nothing. But I knew that given the time period, they had to have been here, and they were here. And I was always curious about what they thought, what they said, what their neighbors who were Confederates probably might have, what did they do? I'm guessing there were no rebel flags. I'm guessing they didn't talk about it much. But there was one incident that we found where if you want to be a state official or a county official, and the Union guys were in charge, that they would insist that you prove that you took the oath of allegiance and that you still weren't a Confederate before they would shake your hand and you become part of county government, because they weren't quite sure. But that was a rare incident where you would see that sort of thing mentioned. But the fact is, as many as I've found, there certainly are more, and hopefully we'll find more. They'd all gone through, a horrific experience of the Civil War. And I'm glad to have, resurrected some of them and some of their stories. Okay, so so those 882 people I mentioned were folks who were in federal regiments that would have qualified for having a pension later. There were a lot of militias around. There was a militia in Campo Seco, there was a militia in Comanche, there was the militia in Copperopolis, Angels Camp. Those were not federal troops. They were essentially the precursor to the National Guard. They had guns, maybe a cannon, and they marched around and practiced marching. They were there under the vague possibility that the Confederates headed west, they would stop them maybe, but they were not Union forces, and they're not included on my list. The only state where that's a serious gray area is Missouri, because there was so much switching back and forth, and people who were in militias joined the federal troops and then sometimes went back and forth between them, that the Missouri folks were given pensions if they were in the militia. But so I've talked to Christopher about this. There's a famous photo of that had been identified as two Union soldiers standing in Copperopolis in their uniforms, and they are not. They're not Union soldiers. Completely wrong uniforms, and there were no Union soldiers in Copperopolis. There was militia.
Who did the armory? Who built the armory?
That was the militia and the local citizens. Yeah. I mean, so that's the distinction to be made. None of those people qualified for a federal pension. you had to be a member of the Army. No, no. And again, and people thought that, essentially the Calaveras area, was responsible for the second most amount of copper to go to the Union, other than Upper Michigan, I believe. And the copper it's a misnomer. People thought it was for bullets. It was never for bullets. They don't use copper in bullets. It was for casting bronze cannon. You needed to cast it in copper, and for telegraph wire. So that's the reason. A lot of this job is researching and correcting, misconceptions, things that have been passed down over the years that, may not be exactly accurate. Yes. Technically, there was none. Oh, sorry. He had said, was there slavery in California? Technically, none. None ever from the beginning. It was essentially outlawed, though, again, a bit of a gray area. The question also is, for example, the Kirk family. I've been over to the Kirk family cemetery, where they came over in 49, 50, 52, and at the cemetery they came with 4 slaves, and there's an iron peg of where the 4 are buried. They don't have any headstone. So the question becomes, and it's convenient to say that they were freed slaves, or that when they hit California they automatically became freed, or they were still slaves and the Kirks freed them, essentially. There's quite a gray area, and there were some miners who, it's one reason, though, why California was, staunchly for the Union. Clearly, so if they took a vote, even though Lincoln did not win by much here, I think if, overall, in terms of soldiers and that sort of thing, it would easily, 10 to 1 or more than that in favor of the Union. There wasn't any question. There was some question in Los Angeles about whether they would be Union or Confederate, but in central Northern California, there really wasn't. Though McComely Hill had 2 newspapers, and one was Union and one was Confederate. This part of the county was often referred to as the Chaparral Confederacy. There were a lot of Confederates out here, in Milton in particular. Again, that organization I was mentioning, the GAR, that was strictly for Union veterans.
As you know, there was conscription in the Civil War. Were any of the Calaveras people under conscription, or were they all volunteers?
All volunteers. Yep. And, I'm sure there was a certain percentage of them volunteered for the bounty. They were paid. Not only were they paid to enlist, but the county got a kickback too. So the county made some money off of that as well. Yeah. And you can imagine, some single guys, working a river, and pretty hard work, and someone offers them, well, why don't you just take your gun for $10 a month, why don't you just join a California regiment, for 3 months, 2 years, whatever it might take. And I'm sure some of them did it, strictly for that reason. But my point is that it was pretty rough. Those folks who went to Arizona, the weather, the terrain, the hostilities, the disease. That's why I include them. They the war might have been over, technically, but they had enlisted beforehand, and they were serving out their term, and It was pretty rough. I hesitate, talking about some of the more gruesome things. I hesitate showing as many, headstones. But I think it's important as to impress upon people exactly how serious this was and how dangerous.
Is there an infrastructure out here in the West for recruitment of people to join, or
Uh,
word of mouth, or where do they go to enlist, or?
Yeah, there were people who were generally captains who would come out, and they would come to Angels Camp and they put out posters saying show up here to enlist, and they, have a table and enlist people. What's interesting, what's different now obviously than then, was you didn't know who someone was. They could tell you their name was John Brown from Arkansas. There was no way to check that name, which is one of the difficulty in research, by the way. Came across a number of people who changed their names for sometimes weird reasons. And you didn't quite know who was who and who was escaping a marriage back east. They said their name was John Brown. Whatever. There was one guy in Angels Camp too, one captain, who claimed that he had fought with the British, that he had fought in the Mexican War, and that he knew all this military stuff. And they said, okay. They made him a captain, and then they quickly realized he had no idea what he was doing, and he hadn't done any of that stuff. And apparently he drank a lot, and they finally, booted him out. But just like Captain Messenger had no military training, but he had $5,000, and he raised a company of troops, and he paid for it, and in his case was, competent and knew what he was doing, and they, made him a captain. Go ahead. You're in charge. Thanks.